Remember the Outlaw Josey Wales? The film plunged us into a brutal chase for survival, and its shadow followed the cast far beyond the screen. From rare illnesses and shattered marriages to tragic, unexpected deaths, their real lives were far darker than you ever imagined. Join us as we uncover their true stories and honor the legacies they left behind. Sondra Locke as Laura Lee. Laura Lee, the fragile, traumatized survivor in The Outlaw Josey Wales, 1976, was brought to life by Sondra Locke. She was 32 years old when she stepped into the role, shaping the film's emotional core with a quiet sorrow that felt almost prophetic. And from that moment, her life and her character seemed to echo one another in ways the audience never saw coming. Born Sandra Louise Anderson on May 28, 1944, in Shelbyville, Tennessee, she carried a private world far harsher than the gentle roles she often portrayed. Her long-time nominal marriage to sculptor Gordon Anderson offered companionship, but not the family she desperately wished for, leaving an emotional vacancy she rarely spoke about. Between public smiles, she anchored herself in work. The Gauntlet, Bronco Billy, Sudden Impact. Even as a quiet ache followed her from set to set. Born into a life marked by both talent and turbulence, she soon found her health becoming a relentless opponent. Cancer struck, retreated, and then returned with a force she could no longer outrun, leaving her fragile as she withdrew from the spotlight. And in those later years, the silence around her personal battles grew heavier, shaped by a lifetime of emotional strain and the shadows of relationships that had carved deep marks into her sense of self. Sadly, Sondra Locke died on November 3, 2018, at age 74 from complications of breast and bone cancer, her heart finally giving out in her Los Angeles home. She was cremated 6 days later, her ashes entrusted to Gordon, the constant presence in her life, despite their unusual bond. At the time of her death, she left behind an estimated net worth of $20 million, money earned through years of struggle, survival, and a fight to reclaim her name. Chief Dan George, as Lone Watty, the weathered, grieving elder who softened the brutality of the Outlaw Josey Wales, 1976, was enacted by Chief Dan George. At 77 years old, he embodied the role, turning wisdom and pain into a performance that seemed carved from his own memory. And as the film unfolded, the line between character and man grew heartbreakingly thin. Born Geswanuth Slahut on July 24, 1899, in North Vancouver, he lived a life defined by endurance long before Hollywood ever noticed him. His marriage was steady, but marked by tragedy, scarred by the devastating loss of 2 children, pain that aged him more than time ever could. And yet, he pushed forward, grounding himself in community work and occasional acting, finding brief refuge in films like Little Big Man, Harry and Tonto, and The Bears and I. Born into a world that tried to reshape his identity, he faced the growing burden of age and illness as his body began to weaken. Heart trouble followed him quietly, pressing into every passing year, while fame brought both admiration and an isolating kind of loneliness. Even surrounded by family, he often carried the silent weight of a leader who knew he would soon have to let go of the world he fought for. Tragically, Chief Dan George died on September 23, 1981, at age 82 from heart failure, his final breath taken in Lions Gate Hospital in North Vancouver. He was laid to rest at Burrard Cemetery, among his people and the land that had shaped every part of his life. His net worth at the time, approximately $100,000, was modest, but his legacy was immeasurable, living on through his poetry, activism, and the generations who still speak his name with reverence. Paula Truman as Grandma Sarah. Grandma Sarah, the sharp-tongued, unbreakable matriarch in The Outlaw Josey Wales, 1976, was embodied by Paula Truman. At 79 years old, she stepped into the role, and behind that tiny frame was a woman who had weathered far more than audiences ever imagined. Born on April 25, 1897, in New York City, Paula Truman grew up surrounded by the noisy pulse of Manhattan, long before the stage would claim her. Her marriage to architect Harold Sterner brought companionship but ended in grief when his declining health consumed their final years together. And through each chapter of her life, she leaned on the stage as refuge, resurfacing in films like Paint Your Wagon, Annie Hall, and Dirty Dancing as if to prove that age could not silence her spirit. Born into a world where women fought for every inch of ground, she carried her loneliness gently but constantly. Without children of her own, she clung to the makeshift families she found in theaters, film sets, and cramped New York apartments. Acting kept her moving, kept her breathing, kept her from collapsing under the weight of career. Sadly, Paula Truman died on March 23, 1994, at age 96, passing away from natural causes in the same city that had witnessed her first curtain call. At the time of her death, her estimated net worth, about $500,000, came mostly from her small New York apartment and the treasured artifacts of a life devoted to performance, each item whispering the story of a woman who gave everything and asked for almost nothing in return. William O'Connell, as Sim Carstairs. Sim Carstairs, the anxious ferryman in the Outlaw Josey, Wales, 1976, was brought to the screen by William O'Connell. He was 47 years old when he stepped into the role, turning jittery humor into an unforgettable moment in the film's bleak frontier. And from that small appearance, his life story unfolded far more quietly than anyone ever realized. Born on May 12, 1929, in Los Angeles, California, he carried a life shaped by service, restraint, and the loneliness that often follows men who never quite escape supporting roles. His marriage grew strained over time, hollowed out by years of career instability, and the couple never had children. Between long stretches of work, he found small islands of recognition in shows like Star Trek and films such as The Poseidon Adventure and High Plains Drifter. Born into a generation that rarely spoke of heartache, he drifted through his later years in growing solitude. The more time passed, the more he withdrew into a life marked by routine, memories, and the quiet ache of knowing fame had touched him only lightly. His body aged gently but unmistakably, carrying the weight of years spent watching others rise while he remained a constant but overlooked presence. William O'Connell died on January 15, 2024, at age 94, passing away naturally in his Sherman Oaks home. His departure was just the final closing of a long career. At the time of his death, he left behind an estimated net worth of about $1 million, built from decades in television, small film roles, and the modest home where he spent his final years. Len Lesser as Abe, the wary settler in the Outlaw Josey, Wales, 1976, was interpreted by Len Lesser. At 54 years old, he joined the film, bringing a rugged mix of humor and unease that colored his brief but memorable scenes. And behind that familiar face was a man carrying far heavier stories than the characters he portrayed. Born on December 3, 1922, in the Bronx, New York, he grew up in a working-class family before finding his way onto stages and television sets across America. His marriage to actress Jan Burrell lasted nearly 3 decades before collapsing under the pressure of a career that demanded more time than he ever meant to give. Their divorce fractured the family, leaving emotional distances between him and his children that time never fully repaired, even as he continued acting in works like Kelly's Heroes, Get Smart, and the iconic Seinfeld years later. When he was young, he served in World War II before returning to Hollywood with a resilience forged in hardship. But illness shadowed his final years, pneumonia striking with the relentless force that often follows long, exhausting careers. Even as he appeared in Everybody Loves Raymond and other late-life roles, his body grew weaker. Sadly, Len Lesser died on February 16, 2011, at age 88, after pneumonia complications took hold in Burbank, California. His children and grandchildren survived him, carrying the memory of a man who made the world laugh even when his own life felt heavy. At the time of his passing, his net worth, about $1 million, came from a lifetime of steady character work and the modest Burbank home where his story quietly came to an end. Bill McKinney as Captain Terrell, the ruthless commander hunting down the last rebels in the Outlaw Josey, Wales, 1976, was embodied by Bill McKinney. He was 45 years old when he delivered the cold intensity that made the character unforgettable. And behind that venomous glare was a man whose real life carried even deeper scars. Born on September 12, 1931, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, he lived a life shaped not by privilege, but by survival, a past marked by instability that followed him long into adulthood. His marriages were short, fractured by the emotional wreckage of early abuse. While audiences knew him from fierce roles in Deliverance and First Blood, off-screen he carried a loneliness that hardened him far more than any character he portrayed. Born into a world that seemed determined to test him, he pushed himself relentlessly through acting schools, odd jobs, and a career that typecast him as villains he never fully escaped. The darker his characters became, the more Hollywood believed that was all he could be, leaving him fighting for roles that showed the man behind the menace. And as years passed, illness crept closer, esophageal cancer tightening its grip while he continued to work, sing, and perform. Bill McKinney died on December 1, 2011, at age 80, after cancer finally claimed the voice that had terrified audiences for decades. He passed away in Van Nuys, California, leaving behind a son and the complicated, turbulent history of several former wives. At the time of his death, his net worth, around $5 million, came from a California ranch, a collection of vintage cars, and a lifetime of roles that carved him into cinema history as one of Hollywood's most unforgettable villains. John Vernon as Captain Fletcher. Captain Fletcher, the conflicted officer who briefly stands between duty and conscience in the Outlaw Josey, Wales, 1976, was portrayed by John Vernon. At 44 years old, he performed the role, bringing a stern authority that made the character feel both threatening and tragically human. And beyond the uniform lay a man whose own life bore fractures no script could fix. Born on February 24, 1932, in Zaner, Saskatchewan, Canada, he built his life around discipline, craft, and a perfectionism that often strained his closest relationships. His marriage to Nancy West unraveled under the pressure of constant travel and long separations, leaving emotional gaps that even his deep love for his 3 children could not fully close. Though audiences remember him from Dirty Harry and Animal House, he carried a quiet exhaustion from decades of typecasting. Besides, he trained rigorously in London and Canada, giving himself fully to a profession that rarely gave back with equal kindness. Each year, the demands of authority figure roles weighed heavier, and behind the stern exterior audiences knew, his health began to falter. Heart complications emerged gradually, creeping into his life with a quiet inevitability, even as he continued voice work and appearances that kept him tied to the craft he refused to abandon. John Vernon died on February 1, 2005, at age 72, from complications following heart surgery in Los Angeles. His passing left behind a home filled with scripts, recordings, and memories of a man who gave everything to his work. At the time of his death, his estimated net worth of $10 million reflected decades of steady roles, investments, and the Los Angeles residence where his final days unfolded. Sheb Wooley as Travis Cobb. Travis Cobb, the wiry, sharp-mouthed rider in the Outlaw Josey, Wales, 1976, was portrayed by Sheb Wooley. He was 55 years old when he stepped into the role, adding a flash of frontier grit shaped by decades of music and film. And behind that brief appearance was a man living a life far louder and more chaotic than the quiet scenes he inhabited on screen. Born on April 10th, 1921, in Eric, Oklahoma, he spent adulthood trying to balance two careers that constantly pulled him in opposite directions, acting and country western music. His personal life was stormy. 5 marriages, one ending in a bitter divorce, and years of distance from his daughter that left a quiet wound he rarely addressed publicly. Audiences knew him from High Noon, Rawhide, and the massive novelty hit Purple People Eater, yet fame did little to soothe the chaos he carried at home. Born into a world where hardship shaped resilience, he carried that toughness into every performance, whether on a film set or behind a microphone. But leukemia began tightening around him long before he stopped touring, forcing him to retreat from the spotlight that had sustained him for decades. His humor, once the driving force of his novelty songs, softened into something fragile as illness claimed more of his strength each passing year. During his final months, he continued writing songs from his hospital bed, refusing to let silence have the last word. Sheb Wooley died on September 16, 2003, at age 82, after leukemia finally silenced the voice that had entertained millions. He was entombed in Hendersonville Memory Gardens in Tennessee, leaving behind family, unresolved fractures, and a career that touched nearly every corner of American entertainment. At his death, his estimated net worth, around $2 million, came from his Tennessee ranch, his musical catalog, and the instruments that accompanied him throughout his life. Bruce M. Fischer as Yoke. Yoke, the towering, menacing enforcer in the Outlaw Josey, Wales, 1976, was brought to the screen by Bruce M. Fischer. At 40 years old, he embodied the role, using his imposing presence to give the film one of its most unsettling figures. And the darkness he carried on camera often mirrored the isolation he lived with privately. Born on March 20, 1936, in Greensboro, North Carolina, he spent his life wrestling with the limitations of being typecast as the big, dangerous man. His marriage collapsed under the weight of his distant nature, and with no children and few lasting relationships, his world grew increasingly narrow. Even as he delivered memorable performances in Escape from Alcatraz, Something Wicked This Way Comes, and The Journey of Natty Gann, the loneliness that followed him remained a constant shadow. He often vanished immediately after filming, disappearing into a life few truly understood. After that, he buried himself in work, taking on roles that demanded physical intimidation rather than vulnerability. But as years passed and age settled in, the solitude he once tolerated became heavier, wrapping around him in the quiet stretches between sparse acting jobs. In later years, he moved to Iowa seeking peace, though the stillness only magnified the emptiness he carried. Bruce M. Fischer died on April 11, 2018, at age 82, from natural causes in Mason City, Iowa. At his death, his estimated net worth, about $1 million, stemmed from a modest suburban home and the film memorabilia he kept from the roles that defined him. His belongings were later distributed among distant relatives and a small circle of friends who remembered the gentle man behind the fearsome characters. John Russell as Bloody Bill Anderson. Bloody Bill Anderson, the ruthless guerrilla fighter who embodies the brutality of the Outlaw Josey, Wales, 1976, was brought to life by John Russell with a cold, steely presence. He was 55 years old when he stepped into the role with the hardened composure of a man who had spent decades inside the dusty world of westerns. His screen time was brief, yet powerful enough to set the film's violent tone, and in many ways the character mirrored the path Russell himself walked, disciplined, imposing, and marked by fractures beneath the surface. Born on January 3, 1921 in Los Angeles, Russell carried a rugged intensity that pushed him into a lifetime of stoic gunslingers and shadowed lawmen. Being typecast in Western roles limited his opportunities, though his work in Lawmen, Rio Bravo, and Soldiers of Fortune left a lasting impression. His personal life unraveled when infidelity ended his marriage, creating a distance between him and his son that haunted the years that followed. Even so, he pressed on, working tirelessly as though every role was a battle to reclaim the dignity that Hollywood rarely offered him. However, Russell pushed himself relentlessly, sometimes forgetting the softer edges needed to break free from the genre that defined him. As Hollywood shifted away from westerns, the walls of his career quietly closed in, locking him into the same grim roles he had outgrown but could not escape. Later appearances in Pale Rider and various television roles proved he still carried depth and gravitas. John Russell died on January 19, 1991, at the age of 70, after a long struggle with emphysema brought on by decades of smoking. At the time of his death, his net worth was estimated at around $2 million, made up of his California home and a collection of antique firearms he lovingly restored in his later years. His passing marked the end of a career built on endurance rather than celebration. Richard Farnsworth as Comanchero, the quiet horseman who appears briefly in The Outlaw Josey, 1976, was portrayed by Richard Farnsworth with a sincerity that only a lifetime of real danger could produce. At 56 years old, he entered the role with the grounded presence of a man who had survived the dust, risk, and anonymity of Hollywood stunt work. His role was small, yet every moment he appeared carried the weight of authenticity. And from that role alone, you could glimpse the hard road that shaped him. Born on September 1, 1920, in Los Angeles, Farnsworth never chased fame. He simply followed the work, spending decades falling off horses, crashing wagons, and performing the dangerous shots no one remembered to credit. His marriage of more than 40 years was the anchor of his life. But after his wife's death, he sank into a quiet sorrow that lingered beneath even his finest performances. Roles in Comes a Horseman, The Gray Fox, and The Straight Story revealed a rare warmth in his eyes, the kind that comes from both pain and wisdom. Despite 2 Oscar nominations, he continued to speak about acting with the humility of a man who saw himself as a worker, not a celebrity. Born with a gentle nature unusual among stuntmen, Farnsworth shifted to acting only when age made the risky work impossible. But changing paths didn't change the burdens he carried. The loneliness after his wife's passing and the limitations of his health followed him through roles in Misery, Anne of Green Gables, and The Natural. As cancer slowly tightened its grip, the once strong cowboy grew visibly tired. On October 6, 2000, Richard Farnsworth ended his life with a single gunshot at his ranch in New Mexico at age 80, after enduring unbearable pain from terminal cancer. His net worth at the time was estimated at around $2 million, including the ranch where he spent his final years and the savings from over 6 decades in film. His death stunned Hollywood, which had long admired him as one of the industry's most authentic and honorable figures. Will Sampson as Ten Bears. Ten Bears, the quiet, commanding elder who brings spiritual gravity to the Outlaw Josey, 1976, was embodied by Will Sampson with haunting dignity. At 43 years old, he stepped into the role not as an actor imitating a leader, but as a man who had lived the weight of responsibility long before Hollywood came calling. His scenes felt less like performance and more like testimony, carrying truths the film itself struggled to contain. Born September 27, 1933, in Okmulgee County, Oklahoma, Will Sampson carried the identity of the Muskogee Nation in everything he did. He rose to fame with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, yet the pressure of representing Native people in an industry that rarely treated them fairly carved deep frustration into his career. His divorce and financial instability strained his life at home, often leaving him torn between providing for his children and resisting roles that exploited his heritage. Even so, he found moments of artistic refuge in painting. Born into a culture rich with tradition, Sampson spent years riding broncos on the rodeo circuit before fate pushed him toward film. The success of Cuckoo's Nest opened doors, but each opportunity carried a quiet burden. He was expected to be a cultural symbol rather than a man with vulnerabilities of his own. Illness shadowed his later work, as scleroderma slowly attacked his lungs and heart, cutting into his physical strength even as he continued taking roles in Poltergeist 2, The White Buffalo, and stage productions celebrating Native history. Will Sampson died on June 3, 1987, at just 53, after complications from a heart-lung transplant left his body unable to recover. At the time of his death, his estimated net worth was around $500,000, made up of his home and cultural artifacts he had preserved and created. His passing ended a life lived between pride and pressure, tradition and survival. Sam Bottoms as Jamie, the hopeful young settler whose innocence flickers briefly in the Outlaw Josey, Wales, 1976, was portrayed by Sam Bottoms with the raw sincerity of youth. When he was just 21 years old, he stepped into the role with a softness that contrasted sharply with the violence around him. His appearance was brief, yet it hinted at a talent capable of stretching far beyond the shadows of the Western frontier. Born October 17, 1955, in Santa Barbara, California, Sam Bottoms grew up in a family shaped by art and performance, though success came with unspoken strain. He became widely recognized after Apocalypse Now, but the chaotic production left him physically damaged, a hookworm infection that permanently weakened his liver. His marriage later dissolved in painful discord, and addiction deepened the distance between him and his children. Despite these struggles, he found meaningful moments in films like Seabiscuit, and in the small creative projects he nurtured quietly in the background. Born into a household of actors, Bottoms entered the industry almost by accident, discovered on a set where he had only planned to watch his brother work. The roles that followed came quickly, but with them came expectations he never felt prepared for. Hollywood often saw him as the boyish, supporting player, limiting his path while he silently battled illness and personal turmoil. Sam Bottoms died on December 16, 2008, at age 53, after a battle with glioblastoma that progressed faster than anyone close to him could accept. He was cremated, his ashes kept by his widow. At the time of his death, his estimated net worth was around $1 million, including his Los Angeles home and a cherished collection of vintage motorcycles he restored between film projects. In the end, their faces rode across the screen like myths, yet their real lives carried a weight no camera ever captured. Some fought illness, some carried heartbreak, and some left us long before the world was ready to say goodbye. Which story will stay with you tonight? If you want to keep exploring the forgotten lives and quiet tragedies behind Hollywood's greatest films, stay with us, subscribe, and let's uncover the next untold story together.